afternoon Book Passage is proud to welcome JoAnn Locktov. JoAnn is the founder of Bella Figura Communications, author and editor. She is with us today to celebrate the publication with Prosecco of her utterly gorgeous travel and photography book, Dream of Venice. The foreword is written by Frances Mays, and it's a collection of excerpts and original texts from a variety of authors, intermingled with these incredibly lush photographs taken by the talented photographer Charles Christopher. Today, she is in conversation with Sandy Popovich, a wonderful friend. They've been friends for years. They've walked together. They've had coffee together. They've just developed this rich, incredible connection that became very fruitful in this wonderful book, Dream of Venice. She's an illustrator, an artist, and a graphic designer. And they will both be discussing this incredible book today. And as Frances Mays states in her foreword, Venice is a state of mind. And this book will take you there. So please join me with welcoming JoAnn Locktov.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. What a nice turnout. Just a little history on JoAnn and my relationship. We were neighbors in our Tam Valley neighborhood, and we would spend mornings taking nice long walks and drinking Pete's coffee. And we would share everything from recipes to talking about kids and everything. And to make a long story short, we crossed paths with our appreciation of art and Venice, and here we are with this beautiful gem of a book to celebrate our relationship. So I'm so thrilled I was able to be a part of this wonderful publication. So again, publicly, thank you, my friend.
You are so welcome.
I've divided this Q&A into 3 parts, and I'm keeping a clock here because I have so many wonderful questions for JoAnn. The first is going to be the passion she has for Italy and the work that she does. The second, we're going to discuss the project and how that actually happened and how this book came to fruition. And lastly, we'll talk about finally being published and how wonderful that is, giving birth to this book. So I will start by asking JoAnn, tell us about your first trip to Italy.
My first trip was actually, can you hear me?
No.
I'll do this a little bit closer. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah.
My first trip was 18 years ago, and I was having one of those really big, significant birthdays. And it was the kind of birthday that it gives you an excuse to do something rather extravagant. And I'd never been to Italy, so I didn't speak Italian at the time. And I knew I wanted to go with a group of people, and I found this wonderful watercolor group that was going, and they were very kind, and they let me go with them because I don't do watercolors. But our first stop was Venice, and I got off the water taxi, and I stepped foot in Venice, and within minutes, 3 things happened. And the first thing that happened was Venice exceeded my imagination. Often before we take trips, we read books and we look at pictures and maybe we look at movies and we think about what it must be like, and then we get there and sometimes it falls a little bit short of what we can imagine. And Venice completely exceeded anything I thought could have existed in this world. And the second thing that happened was that I actually fell in love with the place. And I had never done that before. I actually didn't know it was possible to fall in love with a place on earth. Up until then, I had fallen in love with my husband, I loved my children and my family. But Venice was the first time that I actually had those same set of emotions for a physical place. So those are about the first 2 things. Actually, there was a third one.
Okay, go ahead. You have time.
She's going to keep it really honest. The third one was having fallen in love with Venice and having been overwhelmed by Venice, I made a commitment to figure out a way to integrate Venice into my professional life. Now this was easier said than done because at that point I had no professional life. I was a stay-at-home mom, and it was like, all right, I'm going to figure this out. So I have my work cut out for me.
Well, I think you've answered my second question, which was how you fell in love with Venice.
Yeah.
Unless you have something to add to that. Then I'll go on to, and I think I know the answer, what's your favorite part of Italy? But
You know, I've been able to travel as far south as Rome, which is actually not that far south, but I keep going back to the Veneto, to the area from Venice all the way up to Vicenza, Padua, Verona. It is still my favorite place. When I'm in Padua, I miss Venice. When I'm in Vicenza, I miss Venice. When I'm in Barcelona, I miss Venice. So I'm very consistent. So my favorite part of Italy at this point is the Veneto.
and of course you love the food and the men and the money and all that stuff too. And she's trying to get adopted by an Italian family still.
I think I already have.
I want you to tell me about the most memorable trip and why, and I think I know the answer to this one.
Can I have two?
Yeah, you can have two.
Okay, if I can have two. I had 10 years later, I had another one of those really significant birthdays. And I decided, it's a very European tradition, much more so there than here, that when you're the birthday person, when you're the one celebrating, you honor your friends by giving the party. They don't take you out, you take them out. So I decided I wanted to have a really lovely dinner party in a fabulous restaurant. And I wanted to invite all of my dear friends. And I did that. The only caveat was that dinner was in Venice. So if they wanted to come to my birthday party, they had to come to Venice. And I had 8 American friends come and join me in Venice. And we all, pretty much all stayed at the same pensione. So basically it was a 1-week adult slumber party. And it was, and Sandy was there and Rich was there. And it was very memorable. And there's something very special about sharing your favorite place on earth with your favorite people. So it was really significant. The second most memorable trip would have to be my last one. I now go every year. I go for the month of November. I rent an apartment and I stay for a month. And this one was very significant for me because for 2 reasons. One, I was giving something back. I came with the book in hand and I was able to give something back to Venice. And many of our contributors are Italian contributors and are contributors that live in Italy and in Venice. I hadn't met before. I had met them through email and on the telephone, but we hadn't actually met in person, and we were able to on that trip, and that was amazing. I would say those two.
Well, that birthday party was one hell of a week. I have to tell you, it was probably one of the best trips in my entire life. And going there with JoAnn, leading us to a gondola factory and her favorite restaurants, and walking down her favorite streets. And we were there in November, which meant it was empty of tourists. And it was just spectacular. It couldn't have been staged any better. It was just wonderful. So, if you would read the first passage to close this portion of The Passion of Italy.
I am going to read you, I had a hint of what Sandy was up to. So I chose as my first passage to read to you from a film director. His name is Paul Mazursky. You may know of him. We lost him last year. Really wonderful guy. I chose this passage because Paul and I shared the same initial experience when we went to Piazza San Marco. Let's see if I can do it this way. I went to Rome in 1970 to meet with Federico Fellini. By some magic, I talked him into acting in my next film, Alex in Wonderland. I spent 4 days following him around Rome and begging him to play himself, and finally he agreed. I told him that I had 3 more days to spend in Italy. Should I go to Florence or Venice? Fellini looked at me and smiled. Do you want marijuana or LSD? He asked. I quickly said LSD. Ah, so you want to see Venezia? He smiled. He picked up the phone and called the Daniele Hotel and told them who he was. they quickly made a reservation for me. The first time I saw the Piazza San Marco, I wept. Years later, when I brought my wife to Venice, as we entered the piazza, she too started to sob. Of course, I used that scene in one of my movies, Bloom in Love. Every year or so, I go back to Venice to have a good cry. Should I show you the picture? Is that like too much like show and tell, like library?
No, show us the
This is the photograph that we chose to go in Paul's passage. I don't know if you can even see it, but it's a detail from the piazza.
There are no page numbers in this book. We kept it to a minimum, just the beauty of the photographs and the text. So it was an absolute joy to design. So we'll get back to later on about how JoAnn paired the text with the photos. We're right on schedule. This is fabulous. The project. How did Dream of Venice come about as a book?
About 4 years ago, I'm a publicist, as well as now a publisher. And all good publicists are on social media. We have no choice. It's a tool of our trade. And I was on Twitter, and there was a fellow on Twitter. We found each other. His name is Charles Christopher, and he was a photographer, and he started posting images that he had taken in Venice. And I started looking at these photographs, and I was so in awe. I've never actually counted them, but I have close to 100 books on Venice. I have photography books and history books and crime novels and all sorts of stuff. I had never seen photographs like his body of work. There was an intimacy. They were personal. They were filled with texture. There was a balance of, the Italians call it chiaroscuro, between light and dark. I found them to be completely mesmerizing, and after about 4 months of getting to know Charles and writing back and forth, I said, so, Charles, you want to do a book? And he said, yes. So, we made a book.
The stars aligned. How were your writers chosen?
It was the most amazing and wonderful adventure to find our writers. We knew from the beginning we wanted a vision of a contemporary Venice. We did not want to go back in history. You've all read what some of the more fabulous, between Ruskin and Casanova and Byron, and there's just a body of work. Venice has inspired writers for centuries and centuries and centuries, but we really wanted to focus on what do people think of Venice now? And our criteria was to find people who not only had this very deep connection to the city, but they were able to articulate it in some way. And they were also able to articulate it in a way that hadn't actually been said. So their own experience of Venice was very personal to them. So some people were really obvious. Nicolas Roeg, of course, the British director who directed Don't Look Now, is a mentor to Charles in terms of the way that he does his photography. So it was a natural. Of course we're going to write to Nicolas Roeg. Of course we're going to write to Julie Christie, who starred in the film. Woody Allen, we all know Woody Allen loves Venice. The writers that had written about Venice, everyone from Roger Crowley to Judith Martin, David Hewson. If you guys like Donna Leon, you must read David Hewson. Carnival for the Dead is one of the best crime stories I've ever read about Venice, so that's my plug for David. So there were certain authors that had written about, Matthew White had written about Venice, so we were able to ask them for excerpts from their books. And then we went to Erica Jong because of her writing about Venice. We went to some of the really lovely bloggers that we knew had a deep connection to Venice. We went to poets. I knew that I just happened to know poets that had been to Venice and felt strongly about it, and asked them if they had a poem that they would like to contribute. Some of our writers, it was very exciting how some of it happened. People like Gianpaolo Segusto, his family is Murano nobility. They've been on Murano for 600 years. And when I was meeting with his son about glass in my other life as a design publicist, I found out his father was a poet, a published poet. And Gianpaolo dreamt the poem that he gave us. He literally dreamt it at night. So
how do you get a hold of Woody Allen? Do you just call him at home and say, hey, I'm doing this?
Sure. You know, celebrities all have assistants and people, and Charles is very connected. He is a still photographer in Hollywood with movies, so he's very connected with different celebrities and has access to them in a way that you or I wouldn't have. It was interesting with Woody Allen because we went to him originally, and his assistant said, I'm so sorry, but he's filming a movie in Rome, and he's really busy, and he can't write anything for you. And we're like, okay. And then the filming stopped, and he was doing editing, so we wrote again. We said, so, you're done filming, so how about now? He said, sure. And he sent us something. So some people we had to ask a couple of times. The incredible thing is how few people said no. Less than, on one hand, said no.
Were there any surprises with this book, whether it was, you know, writers contributing or?
There are a lot of surprises. I think the most significant surprise for me was the generosity of our contributors. For Frances Mays to sit and write what she did, she was finishing up Under Magnolia, her magnificent memoir that just came out. We probably corresponded for 6 months, and she kept writing, do I still have time? Do I still have time? And finally, Sandy had to get to work, and I finally had to say, no, you no longer have time. And within 2 days, she sent me something that was it's so lyrical, it's so beautiful. We asked her if we could make it the foreword. We wanted to honor it in some way, and she didn't even hesitate. She said, oh my gosh, I'm so flattered. You want to make what I wrote the foreword? Of course you can. So I'm actually going to read you, the next passage I read you, you tell me when it's time, is one of the surprises.
It's always so much fun when, you know, the book, I know JoAnn's schedule, she was working on the book on weekends, she was doing her business life during the week, and this was going on forever and ever, it seemed like, and for it to finally be like, it's time and we have a deadline, it did make certain people start putting the pen to paper and writing what they needed to write, and I really had to start designing, and my process for design really starts long before I ever start fussing with type fonts and all of that on the computer. It's while I'm vacuuming, it's while I'm scrubbing, it's while I'm shopping or eating or looking at magazines or whatever. Vacuuming is very important. Briefly, how did you decide which photos go with which text?
So it depended. When we invited people to participate, what we did is we made a web page of photographs, about 60 photographs, and we said, this is what the book is going to look like. This is the tone of the book. So some of the writers chose a very specific photograph to either, like Saxon and Henry chose that photograph to write that poem about. Gianpaolo chose that photograph. He dreamt his poem. It was very connected. So either they chose the photograph, or in the sense, something like when Hutton Wilkinson writes about all roads lead to Rome, and for him that meant San Marco, we basically had to use that photograph of San Marco. And then the other passages that don't fall into either of those two categories were really just based on intuition and trying to build a synergy between the visual, the photograph, and the text to come up with something new. But I'm sorry, I have to tell this. The very best story about the photographs is the story about the cover. So the cover is your very most significant photograph. It's your most significant image because it's what people see. It's what gets posted online when people do reviews. It's when you're looking at a shelf of all these wonderful books to choose from. And Charles and I spent weeks, and I mean weeks, narrowing down, arguing. We had a body of 2,000 photographs we were working with. And we finally, after lots and lots of deliberation, we chose the photograph for the cover, and we were so excited. And we sent it to this one, our graphic designer, and she had it for the weekend, and we get an email back on Monday. and she said, this photograph sucks. I have my opinions. And you know, the really great thing is she was right. We had chosen the wrong photograph, and we simply left it up to our designer, and she chose the perfect photograph for the cover. So it was a good lesson. You trust your designer.
Oh, thank you. Well, I actually have to thank my husband Richard and my daughters, because they were all hearing me swear as I was trying to play with the layout and the font and the photo and all that. I just finally said it's not working, and I actually didn't know how tied she was to this cover photograph they had originally chosen. So I was so glad when she let me pick the one I loved. You had a true overall vision for this book, down to the way the paper felt, and can you tell me how you hit upon those particulars that you developed for the physical aspect of this book?
I always wanted this size. I happen to love square books, and many people that I spoke to tried to convince me it needed to be a coffee table book, and I'm so happy I didn't listen to them, because I feel that this is a size that just you can slip under your pillow, you can slip in a suitcase. It's a very endearing, so the size I was very committed to. I wanted a sensual book. How do you make a sensual book? How do you make a book that feels good? And I found out about this laminate process. For those of you that already have the book, you know there's a feel to the cover. And the paper, I drove my print rep crazy, because the paper was either too glossy or it was too matte, and I didn't like any of it. And she really listened. She was incredible, and she came up with this paper. It's called Garda Silk. And I didn't know this when I chose it, but it's made in, manufactured in Italy by a company near Lake Garda. And again, it has a really wonderful feel to it. And the only other thing that I did physically is that these are the end papers. And when you have a book printed, it comes with white. They all come with white. And this costs extra. And when I was doing my budget and I was doing the book, I said, no, there's no way, I can't afford it. We're not going to go with black. It has to be white. And 3 days later, it was like, how can I do this book without black end papers? It's impossible. And I called it. I said, you knew I was going to say this. The idea is that I wanted it to create a little treasure, and none of it would have worked without her contribution, because Sandy was the one who took the photographs and the text and arranged it all and just made all those decisions that we don't really think consciously about, but they're all there when you read the book, and they all contribute to your experience of the book.
Oh, thank you. Well, what was wonderful was JoAnn gave me a ton of reference material. You've heard about how many books she has on Italy, so I absorbed as much as I could looking at what the competition had done. And I also love a square book. We also decided, I think it was on the dedication page, that we would have a lot of white so you could sign books.
I'm really practical.
We took our smart pills. How many publishers did you approach before you decided to sell to them?
I stopped counting after 40. I only knew about traditional publishing. My 2 books were done with Rockport. I figured, who wouldn't want to publish this book? Naively, I thought that. So we went out into the world. We had an agent. We had a book packager. The publisher said it's not worth printing. Nobody will buy it. Nobody's interested. And we have absolutely no desire to do this book. 40 plus publishers told me that. So a very intelligent person would say, obviously there's no market for this book and we should just all walk away from it. But I'm not, I'm a contrarian, and I also, it never occurred to me not to do the book. Never. From the day I asked Charles if he wanted to do a book, I just thought I would go a traditional route. And I have to say, I am so grateful to those 40 publishers because they sent me on an adventure that I have enjoyed, and it's opened this incredible new world to me, and has been one of the more remarkable projects in my career, and I've been very fortunate to do a lot of remarkable projects. So I thank them, every single one of them, every day.
JoAnn has some wonderful books on mosaic art, so you should see what else she's done in her life. But I've heard that we'll be doing 2 more books together that she has. Oh, 4 more? 4. Ka-ching. And she also told me that I'm going to be responsible for designing a package so that she can put them all together and sell it as a package. So I might be talking to my industrial design friend, also a Pratt graduate, Frank Friedman, about how do I design for packaging. But it'll be wonderful. Least favorite part of publishing this?
Oh, that is so easy, proofreading. It is the bane of my existence. Sandy is a perfectionist. Charles Christopher is a perfectionist. Between the 3 of us, we found mistakes up until when the final files were sent to the publisher. We found typos after the final files. Luckily, they let us make the corrections. It was horrible. I have no tolerance for it. It was my least favorite part.
Well, the problem is that every contributor had their own style of writing, whether it was published before or they just wrote it. So there was certain consistencies that we were trying to keep in terms of punctuation and stuff, but then they would be totally blown out of the water if it was published before. So it did drive us crazy, but we had a lot of Prosecco along. So, your most favorite part of this whole event?
It would have to be the people. I would have to say the people, the gifts of friendship that I have made in this project they'll be with me for the rest of my life. It started with Robert Hermit. It didn't start with Robert, but I'll talk about Robert. He is an amazing photographer in New York who also was very frustrated with traditional publishing, and he did his own book. And when I was really stuck, because you would think it's so easy, it's a book, it's got pages, it shouldn't be that difficult, but it's a little tricky. And I would get very stuck, and Robert took me by the hand, and he was my mentor on this project. His book is The New Yorkers. It's fantastic. The people that I met, the contributors, Guido Petropoli, an architect in Italy that worked with Carlo Scarpa for the last 10 years of his life. He ended up finishing Brione Cemetery. Gianpaolo Seguso. Jane Turner Rylands. She is such a character. Do you know her work? She's written 2 books of short stories about Venice. She's married to Philip Rylands, who's the director of the Peggy Guggenheim collection. So when I went to Venice and I met Jane for the first time, she said, well, we're going to meet at Florian's, but you know about the back room. I said, no, I didn't know there was a back room. Well, the Venetians love Florian's, but they would never sit in the front rooms where we all sit, where the tourists sit, where the windows are. There's way in the back, there's a little room, which is the only place the Venetians go, with 2 little tables that are about this big. And they've been in Venice for 40 years, and she regaled me with stories that were, I will never forget. They live across the canal from Fenice. So when the theater burnt, that terrible night that it burnt, they were watching the flames. The heat was coming, the roof was caving in, and the firemen at some point came to them and said, you must leave now. You cannot stay another minute in your apartment. You must leave. It's not safe to stay. And Philip, he turned to her and he said, grab whatever you want. We're leaving now. It may not be here when we get back. So Jane looked around. She had a very small valise. She grabbed her toothbrush. She grabbed her pajamas. And she grabbed Peggy Guggenheim's Fortuny gown. No other clothes, no other artwork, no photographs, just the Fortuny gown. And you know, they were fine. They were able to contain the fire. The theater wasn't, but their building was fine. But to this day, she has no idea why she grabbed the Fortuny gown. So the people, oh, and my readers. It's been extraordinary, the responses that I have gotten from readers. The book was a labor of love, and it has connected with people to a degree that I never imagined. So,
good answer. Would you read a passage to close this portion, and maybe it won't be too long because we're running a little...
Are we running a little late? I'll read it quickly. The most surprising thing was the generosity of writers, really, truly. Roger Crowley is British. He is a maritime historian. He wrote a trilogy. He's writing his fourth, but the trilogy was finished. New York Times best-selling writer. If you haven't read City of Fortune, which is the third book in the trilogy, and if you like anything on water, or even like me, if you don't care about ships battling on water, read it anyway. It's amazing. You can't even believe that it's nonfiction. It's so incredible. So I wrote to Roger and I asked him for an excerpt from his third book in the trilogy for Dream of Venice. And he wrote me back and he said, nope. He said, you can't have one. He said, but I'll write you something original instead. So he did. In quiet back alleys beside still canals, you can lose all sense of time. You feel you might slip between centuries and come out in some other age. The clock on the Merchants' Church of San Giacomo di Rialto reminds me, it wasn't always so. Venice grew rich on trade, and its people lived with a hard-headed sense of time. Public clocks see the pattern of the daily round. Auctions were timed on the life of a candle. The ringing of the Maragona, the carpenter's bell, from the Campanile in St. Mark's Square called the shipwrights to their work. Time was a commodity. It could make the difference between profit and loss, riches and ruin. Venetian people counted carefully the dates for repaying debts, the return of the spice fleets from Alexandria and Beirut, for trade fairs, festivals, and religious processions. The merchants of Venice became the richest people in Europe in the presence of this clock. For hundreds of years, the rotation of its golden rays brought pepper, silk, ginger, glass, furs, and pearls, frankincense, and carpets. Anything that the world might contain here to the Rialto. This was the souk of the Western world. That's the detail of the clock that he's talking about.
Beautiful. So, published with an exclamation point. You've given birth. Let's talk about the day it arrived on your doorstep and you opened that package, and what was your first reaction to this wonderful baby?
Relief. For more ways than one. It arrived on my doorstep on a Saturday morning, and I was leaving the next day to go to Venice for a month, and I was not going to go to Venice without the book. And the printer had told me for at least the month prior there was no way they could get me the book before I left. It wasn't their fault. You reserve time with the press, and that's the way it happened. So I looked into DHL, I looked into a slow boat. I was going to, even if it cost me more than it did to print the book, I was going to send books to Venice. And on Thursday, they said, we think we can overnight you books. And on Friday, I got the tracking number. And on Saturday morning, the books arrived. I probably shed a tear, I'm sure. I'm so sentimental. Took a photograph, sent it to you guys, and then had to take everything out of my suitcase because I put in 25 pounds of books, and I had to take out all my clothes, and I figured, if I run out of clothes in Venice, it's no big deal. I can go shopping in Italy, but I need the books, and so I had them, and I brought them.
All you need is one black outfit.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I do. It's our uniform. So tell us about Save Venice and how you got involved in the checks you're writing to them through the sale of this book. How lucky they are.
How lucky they are, exactly. It was always a component of this book to give money back to Venice, to help strengthen this city. The question was, how do you do that in a way that makes sense? And Save Venice is probably the most prestigious organization that is raising funds for Venice, certainly here in the United States, maybe in the world. And it was really interesting because when I went to them, they said, please don't take this personally, but we get requests just about every day to put our name on stuff. People love giving us money, they love collaborating with us, and we say no to basically everyone. I said, okay, well, take a look at what I'm doing and let me know. And they did, and they said, we love your book. We would be honored to be a part of it. And you know, this is a small little book. They raise millions of dollars. They have galas in New York with celebrities in Vogue magazine. So it was never about the finances. They wanted to be associated with this book, so it was really lovely. And we've already sent them our first check, and they will continue to get checks as long as the book is in print.
What a mitzvah. Did working with the material in the book make you see Venice differently as you walked around last November?
You know, it did, because like the people who live there, you go to a place repeatedly and you stop seeing it. And I would love to say that I am different than everyone else, but I'm not. I'm exactly the same. And when I was there in November, the photographs are so personal, and there's so much texture, and there's so much about light, and there's so much about shadows, that when I was there, I saw things differently. I looked differently. And one of the most, I've been very blessed to receive some wonderful feedback, but one of the most wonderful things was when a fellow who lives in Venice thanked me for the book, and he said, you have taught me to see my city differently.
Cool.
New eyes.
Yeah.
So, plans for the future?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really serious about this book stuff. It's been incredible. I actually have 4 books in the works. The next book will be on architecture. I'm working with Paul Clements, who's an award-winning, brilliant architectural photographer. The book after that will be design. The book after that will be art. The book after that I can't really talk about yet. So yes, this is what I do now, along with everything else. And you're going to be very busy.
I need to be busy. We share a lot of pasta and prosecco and all that, so I know that's in my near future. Would you read one final passage? And we're actually running about 5 minutes ahead of time, so if you wanted to read a couple, that...
No, I can just read one.
Okay.
Maybe you guys have questions. Yeah? Do you guys know Marcella Hazan? So you all know Marcella. So Marcella is basically the godmother of Italian cooking, credited with bringing true, authentic Italian cooking here to the United States. And Marcella, as a young bride, she and Victor, her husband, left Italy and they came to New York. In the short version, you know, James Beard discovered her and the rest is history. And at some point in their marriage, they decided, they opened a cooking school in Bologna, and they decided to live in Venice. And they lived in Venice for 20 years. And when I wrote to Marcella and I asked her to contribute, I assumed Marcella would write about the Rialto market, right? I mean, Marcella would write about the food. She would write about the fish and the vegetables and what makes the food of Venice so spectacular and so different. And she sent me something back, but she didn't write about food. The Rhythms of Venice, its spaces, its structures, mirror human life to a degree unmatched by any other major historical city. Like its human presences, Venice has a distinctly separate waking time and dream time. Her waking hours resound with natural sounds, footfalls echoing off the paving stones, voices in conversations, voices calling, wailing, singing, carousing, boatmen's cries. The scale of the city is humanly measurable. Its distances are calculated by how long one's feet will take to reach any destination, while its buildings, even the grandest, are congenially accessible to human needs and respectful of human proportions. At night, Venice's lights dim. Its sounds are submerged in those of slapping water, and it wraps itself in mystery, as does our consciousness when dissolved in sleep. She was so cute. She sent it to me, and I think she felt a little guilty, maybe, that she didn't send me something about food. And she said, well, I'm sending you this, and I hope it's okay, but if you want a recipe, I can send
it. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this little journey to Venice on this. This day actually reminds me of the time we went to Venice. It was a little foggy and hazy and cold and wintry and all, but I'd like to open it up to questions for JoAnn and Jody.
JoAnn, I'm just curious, since all these people were thrilled to contribute, and they were writers and poets, it sounds like a lot of well-known people. Do you pay them for all their contributions? How does this financially all work? And the photographer and because then you're saying that when you sell it, the proceeds are, what's the percentage going to, say, Venice?
A certain amount of the questions that you asked are proprietary that I'm not going to answer, but I will tell you that not one of our contributors even asked to be paid. They didn't even, and I would have actually, I expected them to.
Yeah.
It wasn't a project that, no one's going to make a lot of money off of this book. It really is a labor of love, as I already mentioned, and I think that they felt that. And an author can do it two ways. A writer can either give you their work if they own the copyright and give you permission, or that you can go through their publisher and you can pay permissions. The only permissions I actually paid for, you'll see at the beginning, actually on the copyright page and on her page, is that Jane, I went through Random House for Jane's. The fee was much, much less than everyone warned me it would be. And I think that has to do with who owns the copyright on Jane's book at this point. But not one of the other contributors even brought up money.
Okay, so when you decided to do this, all the costs and everything affiliated with creating the book were on you.
Yes.
Because you didn't have a publisher backing you.
Yeah, traditionally you would go to a publisher and you would give them your work and they would pay for it, and you would, in these days hardly anyone gets advances, and they would give you a royalty once they made all their expenses back. Or you would go to a publisher and they would say, we would be delighted to publish your book. We need a check from you for between $50,000 and $80,000. That in publishing now, that's what's happening with picture books. That's kind of the way it's going.
And Charles donated his photos to you in exchange for getting this wonderful book.
Well, Charles was very happy to have a portfolio of his work. Yeah.
That's great.
Any other questions? Yes.
Can you tell us who Charles H. is?
Yeah, it's Charles's father.
Oh.
Rebecca.
Sandy, can you describe when you got the material and you had time to work with it, and it was under deadline, I think, how you...
Besides the vacuuming, how do I design?
Because it's the flow of it and the rhythms of it are so unexpected and rich and vibrant.
Design is a very strange process. I still to this day, and I've been designing for many, many, many years. It's always interesting to me how it all comes together. And I feel like once I hear about the project, I just start absorbing things around me. And seriously, it might be, my husband's an architect, Richard Pollock, and he gets a lot of trade journals and architectural related stuff, and I get exposed to that world, that design world, but I pick up things. I just, I'll look at fabrics or you know, three-dimensional spaces, or I'll, you know, I love to cook, so to me, like designing a book, I look at the colors on the plate and the textures and all of that stuff. So design for me is a continuous process. It's always going on. So when I finally got the manuscript from JoAnn, and she had put it in a beautiful little binder, very well organized. I love organization. To me, organization is the key to keeping sane. And so I looked at the photographs, I looked at the text, and I just started, I mean, I really knew simplicity because of the beauty of these photos. Simplicity was the key. I said, don't even put folios, don't even put page numbers, you know, we don't want to busy up the page. And I chose fonts that were very clean, and seriously, less is more in my world. So it's just a number of things like that that, you know, end up as a beautiful finished product. But it's always different, and I swear I go into every project still feeling fear, like, oh, this is going to be the one time I'm not going to come up with that solution, that idea. I still do it. I also, you know, feel that in a lot of other things I do in terms of, I almost think of this as a performance. And I go into performances sometimes going, this is the time I'm going to screw up. But anyways, luckily it hasn't happened that much yet, so. Okay, sorry.
What prevents you from traveling south, southern Italy?
Time. Just time.
That's it?
That's all.
I had right back there.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. Number one, from the time that you consciously decided, I'm going to do this book, to the time that it showed up on your doorstep, you might have mentioned, if you did, I apologize. How long was that? And my second question is, you've got all these other books in the works. Was self-publishing a rewarding enough experience that you would self-publish again?
I'm doing all the rest of the books myself. I would not go to a publisher at this point. There's no reason to.
Okay.
There's literally no reason to. And from the time I decided to do the book myself and not use a traditional publisher, I didn't have a choice.
Right.
Exactly 11 months.
Oh, wow, that's fast.
But you have to understand there were 2 years prior to that we were collecting information. We had the proposal circulating with, so we had the majority of the materials, but from the time I decided I'm going to publish this book myself, it was January of last year, and it was on my doorstep November 8th of 2014.
That's fantastic.
She's really fast.
Yes.
How are the people of Venice feeling about the high tides and the prospect for the
The
future?
people of Venice have been experiencing high tides for 1,500 years. So it's not the concern is more the billions of dollars that has been spent and the billions of dollars that has been stolen to create Mose, to do the gates that will not even keep the piazza from being flooded. High tide is a very natural occurrence. As I said, I mean, it's the nature of the lagoon and the tides. The fact that it's happening more is, of course, something that's happening to our world.
And that's what I'm asking about, the increasing level of the high tides.
They know how to avoid it. You know, you have to understand that the news media picks up on the piazza, which is the lowest point in San Marco and obviously the most familiar and most recognizable. So of course the news media is going to pick up on people, idiots, swimming in the water. If they knew the bacteria in that water, they would not be swimming in it. But the Venetians know it's 4 hours in, you know, you deal with it for 4 hours and the tide goes, it's a tide, so it goes in and it goes out. They know where the high ground is. They know exactly where to go to avoid it. Shopkeepers have their steel walls, you know, that they put up when they're on the ground floor. So they actually can deal with the occurrence of high tide. It's sort of the political and the other things around the high tide that's much more troublesome. Does that make sense? And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make fun of your question.
Jody?
When I lived there 42 years ago. You know, the place was flooded, and everyone I spoke to, and it was heartbreaking for me then, said that there's no way, no matter how much money they throw at it, you can save Venice. Ultimately, the waters will take it. I mean, it's just the way it is, and so many of the buildings will collapse. I don't know what they're saying now, but I mean, then I was studying there, and the experts were saying that.
It's still there.
Yeah.
Buildings are still
But 42
standing.
years is a very small amount of time.
The
yeah.
damage that's being done is not by Aqua Alta. The damage that's being done is by the motorboats. The waves are eroding the foundations. So hopefully with the new administration that they eventually will have in place, they will start dealing with the motors, because that actually is what's causing the damage, as I understand it. You could find someone easily to tell you something different, but from my own experience, that's what's causing the
I think we
problem.
have time for one last
One last question. Yes?
JoAnn, I think in November may be one of your favorite times in Venice. What is your favorite time in Venice?
You're right. It's November. November just sort of works for me. I don't like the hot weather. Even though I'm one of them, I don't love tourists. And November the weather is very similar to here in November. La nebbia, the fog comes in, there's a little bit of rain, it's not that cold like it is now. You would really almost never see it snowing. It's what I call leather jacket weather. And it is very quiet. And it just is that shoulder season before people come in for the holidays. High season is now through October. And November is when people sort of forget about Venice. And I only recommend that people go in the winter between November and March, avoiding Carnivale in February.
This is why she's still living in her foggy Tam Valley neighborhood, and I moved to the sun in Sonoma. Opposites attract. I'm so glad our lives came together, and I was attracted to you and your work, and we have many more wonderful things ahead of us. And thanks to all of you for taking this little trip to Venice today. And JoAnn will be signing books.
Thank you
so much.